Welcome to another edition of Talk About It, a video series where experts and people with lived experiences will discuss issues and topics around substance use disorder. This series was created by Partnership to End Addiction, a national nonprofit that helps families prevent and treat addiction and support recovery for their children and loved ones. Partnership to End Addiction provides free, confidential support for families looking for answers for themselves and their loved ones. I am your host, GloZell. Today we will be discussing challenges and barriers people with addiction face. Today with us we have Carleah Summers. Carleah Summers is a mother in long-term recovery and a recovery advocate. After her family was personally affected by addiction, she made it her mission to keep families together instead of tearing them apart. We also have Tonia Ahern. Tonia Ahern is a parent and recovery coach who works with the Mental Health Association in New Jersey. She became an advocate for family education and resources after years of trying to support her son, diagnosed with substance use and mental health disorders. Tragically, she lost her son earlier this year. And we have Lindsey Vuolo. Lindsey Vuolo heads up health law and policy at Partnership to End Addiction. She drives policy change to help individuals with substance use disorder and their families. Okay, let's start with the questions. What barriers did you face when trying to get help for addiction?
Well, I can say personally, as a person in long-term recovery, I've faced quite a few barriers. And the first barrier started with getting my family to understand that I was suffering with a substance use disorder. And the second barrier came as a mother of a 10-month-old son, was making the decision of whether to leave my child or to go into treatment. And thankfully, my family stepped up and helped me, because without them, I would not be in long-term recovery today. And my son may be a product of the system. And so there were quite a few challenges for me to enter treatment.
Oh my goodness, nobody thinks about that. If you go into treatment, what happens to your children?
Well, I also, as a mother, my son started struggling when he was around 15 years old. And it was about 18 is when I started looking, or 17, 18, I started looking for treatment for him. And at that time, it was back in 2009, I believe, there really wasn't much out there. And every time I made a phone call, it was some organization trying to get me to mortgage my house. I had to have good insurance. And if I didn't have the cash to put him into treatment, they really didn't want anything to do with them.
Both Carleah and Tonia's stories really reflect a lot of policy barriers and a lot of the problems that we have in addressing addiction. There is not nearly enough treatment to help all the people that need it. A lot of that treatment is ineffective. Some of it is downright fraudulent, and that's largely because it's not well integrated in the addiction with the mainstream healthcare system. It sort of operates in these shadows, and that's really reflective of a tremendous amount of stigma against this disease, and so it's not something that the medical field has really stepped up to integrate, and that's because it's been criminalized for so long. The stigma against addiction is profound, but Carleah really highlights the profound stigma against women, and particularly mothers who are suffering with substance use disorder, and where the approach has really been to take a very punitive approach to their substance use rather than getting them treatment, and not thinking about the importance of providing holistic treatment to both the mother and the child. And so unfortunately, as she mentioned, a lot of times the outcome is to remove the child from the mother and place them in the foster care system, and that just has tremendous negative effects for both the mother and the child.
I like what Lindsey said about it being punitive, because that's how it's viewed. And once you involve the foster care system, the mother pretty much is defeated at that point. It's this long uphill battle that takes years at a time to get a child back into full custody. So we're not talking about gradual reunification and the visitation process. We're talking about full custody, which can take anywhere from 18 to 24 months. And by this point, the mom is exhausted. It does become very punitive. There's always this barrier of everyone wants to give you information, and then you know that when someone is ready to go to treatment, there's a very small window.
It's very difficult for women who have children to get the help they need and to get the support in the system that they should get to be able to keep their child with them.
What kind of things do they need to have in place? Like, they need to have a job, they need to have a place to live, you know, and you're coming out of treatment and you don't have these things. Is that the circle that keeps happening?
So you're leaving treatment, now they're saying you have to go to IOP, but you make sure you take time with your child. When can you take time with your child? You have to have a job. You have to go to IOP, which is 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. You have to go to so many meetings for support. There's all these stipulations, and a lot of times when women leave and they don't have transportation, how do they get to these things? How many hours a day are they traveling while they're trying to take care of a child as well? The idea is that they're reunifying with their child and they're building this relationship, but you're taking them away from the child all the time and not realizing the stress.
That's so true. And I would say, you know, the biggest thing here is that you're forcing, you know, individuals to choose between recovery and parenting when it's all said and done, right? So it's almost like it's set up for failure, you know, and so it becomes a true task for individuals like Tonia, Lindsey, and myself to try to encourage people to keep going with all these barriers and these hurdles that they have to jump along the way.
Lindsey, you touched on this. Do you have any experience with the criminal justice system?
You know, the main problem has been that addiction is a disease, but we've treated it like a moral failing, like a crime, like something that needs to be punished, and so therefore we put it under the purview of the criminal justice system. But that's not what it is, right? The response is not matching the problem, and so it's been extremely ineffective, and it's just meant that a lot of resources are getting diverted to ineffective policies and strategies instead of ones that would be more effective if we embraced more of a public health approach like we do for other diseases. And so we're in the middle of this, you know, moment to really move addiction out of the criminal justice system and into the healthcare system. The problem is once they end up in the criminal justice system, they're not getting treatment. They're not getting any services to help them recover from their addiction. They're punished, but you're not actually resolving the problem. And punishing someone, trying to teach them a lesson, isn't going to cure their disease. And that's unfortunate because addiction is a treatable disease and many people can and do recover. And so that should really be the focus, rather than the punishment and labeling them and having them have to carry around a criminal record for their illness.
Right, and a criminal record will prevent them from getting the job. I mean, and that circle goes on and on. But you said it should go more for in the healthcare area?
Right, so if we think about it as an illness, and we know that it is, brain research supports that, then we deal with illnesses in our healthcare system. There's no other illness for which we arrest people or send them to jail or threaten to punish them. And there are behavioral aspects to other illnesses as well, right? We don't, really good examples, diabetes, right? Diabetes might be caused by or exacerbated by behavioral choices, but we don't punish people for that. We give them more support. We give them more treatment. We try a different course of treatment. You know, with addiction, it's something that needs to move under the purview of the healthcare system. But because it was criminalized, it was really removed from the healthcare system.
My son is an example of someone who was, the criminal justice system took over his life and held him captive for 11 years. And that was 11 years for nothing more than possession. The system just, he was 29 years old when he died. He never got to go on vacation. He never left the state. These are things, there were rights that he never had because he was stuck in criminal justice.
Yeah, and Tonia, I think that's a really good point is, we talk about it being punitive within the criminal justice system, but it's not just that people are referred to the criminal justice system. It's that punitive, that let's punish approach trickles through everything. It's what's told to families, right? To in the moment in which their family member needs them the most and needs support and needs love to help them get through something that's very difficult, this sort of like general consensus among the public is let them go. They need to figure this out on their own. Schools often, when they identify a student who maybe is using substance use, they're punished, they're expelled, they're kicked off the sports team. Again, our inclination has been to push people away and to punish them when we know that people who are suffering with addiction, and especially when they're really starting to hit these negative consequences, they need to be wrapped in support.
So if you have money, though, and you have a really good attorney, you actually can get out of a lot of the charges, or you can go to treatment and they'll drop the charges, and you never see the same consequences that my son saw. It's really a very unfair system, because if you do have money, you can get out of the trouble.
Yeah, and addiction doesn't discriminate at all. It affects everyone, all races, all, socioeconomic classes, but our response to addiction does. And criminalization has been very discriminatory and has had a tremendously harmful impact on communities of color. So not only is criminalization ineffective, but it's also discriminatory and it's caused tremendous harm.
The war on drugs disproportionately impacted communities of color. Why do you think policies have been applied differently based on race? I'm looking at you, Carleah.
So this is like the elephant in the room, right? There's nothing new under the sun. This systemic racism has been going on for years. And when we talk about people of color being affected disproportionately by this, it is tremendous, and it is something that is not getting better. I would go out on a limb to say it's getting worse. There are more Black males incarcerated than any other race at this point. And why is that? Because it's because of the suppression, the housing, down to neighborhoods, environments, housing, lack of resources, lack of access to healthcare, and treatment. And so when you see these things, again, this is starting off at very young ages. This is what goes on. It's a generational thing. And unfortunately, we don't have access to the same resources. This is another thing that I advocate for. It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't even matter what your socioeconomic status is. This disease affects everybody. And so why is it being treated as if it doesn't affect everyone? It has nothing to do with our color or our gender or anything else.
The war on drugs really embodies both stigma against addiction and racism. And what we know is that because of systemic racism in the criminal justice system, that those punitive policies really get applied disproportionately, right? And the research shows us this, because we know that white, Black, and brown Americans use drugs at similar rates, but Black and brown people are significantly more likely to be arrested and incarcerated. We know that we need to address this more as a healthcare system to take away some of that bias, but we also do have bias over in the healthcare system as well. And we see that, Carleah just mentioned communities having more difficulty accessing treatment. One specific issue is around buprenorphine, which is an FDA-approved medication for opioid use disorder. But white Americans are far more likely than Black Americans to receive that type of treatment. And that is an office-based treatment that you can get from you can get this medication from a qualified provider. But Black Americans are more likely to get methadone, which is also an effective FDA-approved medication, but it's delivered in a highly stigmatized environment. You have to go to a methadone clinic every day. There are all kinds of restrictions around it. And so you're seeing disproportionate receipt of treatment. And that's why it's been so difficult for us to address this, because for as a society and for elected leaders, because there's just so many things that have to be done. It feels overwhelming. But I do think that really integrating this with the healthcare system is really an important start, a really big component of getting to where we need to go.
About how long do you think it would take to move it to healthcare, we're talking like so many laws, so many things that have to happen, a few presidents down the road, or?
Typically, policy changes take a very long time. Changes to the healthcare system take like 30 years. They take a generation. It's very slow to change and integrate policy changes. And I used to think, this is something that's just going to take a long time. And then COVID came along, right? So we've got 2 public health crises in this country. The urgency with which we've responded to these 2 crises could not be more different, right? So one,
thank you.
We changed everything overnight. Vaccines typically take decades to come out. One was out within a year. This is what happens when you put political will and resources behind something.
It's not a funding issue. It's a prioritization issue. And it is imperative, and I'm going to say it over and over again, that those of us who have been privileged enough to make it into recovery, that we recover out loud and we continue to speak for those who don't have voices right now, because 100,000 people losing their lives is beyond unacceptable at this point. It is beyond unacceptable.
This is also an issue that wasn't talked about at all years ago. And so people like Carleah who are personally in recovery, who are coming forward and sharing their story, is incredibly powerful. And Tonia as well. These, most families, they didn't talk about it, right? Because the notion was like, well, if that's going on in your family, like, you must be a bad family. There was so much, which is absolutely not true, but there's so much shame and stigma around this. And so we've really seen a sea change in the way that people are talking about this. It is really helping to move the progress. And so I'm so incredibly grateful to people who are speaking up and using their voice, because those stories and the way in which people can talk about how these barriers have affected them personally can go so much further in changing policy than any amount of research that we can put in front of policymakers.
I didn't know anything about addiction, or, I didn't know where to go for resources. But in 2011, I never even heard of anyone in recovery. I didn't even know what that meant. So it's amazing now that we talk like we do, and that we have people in recovery that can share their stories, and they came out of the basements, right, of the AA meetings and the NA meetings. And not only that, is that they open their arms to all types of recovery, not just a 12-step recovery. They're opening arms to just helping anyone and accepting, people where they are, which is huge. And it's, we're hoping to educate families as well. The families understand that there's all types of ways to recover. And, the more we all know and the more we all work together, the better everyone is.
Thank you. Carleah, do you have any last remarks?
I just really hope by this series airing that people will get the courage to speak up. For one, speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. But on the flip side of that, I hope that someone watching this series who needs help knows that it's okay to get help, that we are helping to reduce that stigma, and that it's okay to have a substance use disorder, and it's okay to ask for help. And I think by, talking about it in this form, that we're making it easier for individuals to do so.
That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Carleah, Lindsey, and Tonia for joining us. For more information and resources, please visit drugfree.org. I'm your host, GloZell, for Talk About It, a series by Partnership to End Addiction.